So now I'm going to talk about pork. This is the last industry that I'm going to talk about. So just some background, pigs are actually known as the fourth smartest animal. They're a lot smarter than dogs and cats and a lot of animals we keep as pets. They're also really friendly and social animals. So on factory farms, pigs begin with a pregnant sow, and she's kept pregnant for the vast majority of her life. So after her piglets are weaned, she's given a hormone injection that allows her to be ready to be artificially inseminated again in only 3 weeks. So she spends her entire life either pregnant or nursing. So 4 out of 5 sows spend the 16 weeks of their pregnancy confined in gestation crates, which are so small that they can't even turn around. This is a gestation crate right here. Extreme mental suffering is caused by boredom, isolation, and also thwarting of the sow's powerful urge to prepare for her coming piglets. So mother pigs often show signs of insanity, such as obsessively chewing on the bars or banging their heads against the crate. In nature, pigs would forage and build a nest out of leaves and straw to birth their babies, but on factory farms they weren't given any bedding, and so they often develop really large sores from chafing against these metal crates. Pigs also have an innate tendency to use separate areas for sleeping and for defecating. They're actually really clean animals in that regard, contrary to popular belief. But this is completely thwarted in confinement. So obviously, if the pig doesn't move from the space for 16 weeks, it can't go to a different place to defecate. They're standing on top of a slatted floor, and so when they pee or poop, it just goes straight beneath them. Sometimes they even have to step on their excrement to force it through the floors. And then this is hosed out like once a day or so. So you can see here like the filth kind of leaking out, and they're literally standing on top of their waste. So obviously this is really unsanitary, and there's tons of ammonia building up, so it's really irritating for the pigs too. After giving birth, the sows are confined to farrowing crates. This is a farrowing crate. And this is just as, if not more restrictive than gestation crates. Sometimes pigs are even strapped to the floor when they're in these farrowing crates. And here they're forced to continuously nurse their piglets without being allowed any other form of contact with them. So here you see a natural pig nest where she's kind of like nuzzling her piglets, and that's a farrowing crate. So this is another issue for like feminist theory. So those who defend factory farms argue that these farrowing crates are necessary because otherwise the sows would accidentally crush their piglets. And it's true that if all you did was take out those metal bars, she might crush her piglets, but obviously it's not really a good evolutionary strategy to crush all of your offspring. So like if they're given any bedding and if they're given any space to stretch their legs, they will not crush their piglets. So this is just like chicken debeaking. It's these unnatural conditions creating these problems that lead to even more unnatural solutions, like strapping pigs to the floor. So once the piglets are born, within the first 48 hours, they have their tails cut off without any anesthetic in order to prevent them from biting each other from the stress of the cramp conditions. That's just like chicken debeaking. Then within 10 days, 90% of all male piglets have their testicles torn out, again without pain relief, because Americans currently prefer the taste of castrated animals. By the time farmers begin weaning them, 15% of the piglets will have died from stress and injuries from these practices. In the wild, pigs wean around 15 weeks, but on factory farms they're weaned around 15 days because the sooner they're fed solid food, the sooner they're fat enough to slaughter. Okay, so this is a picture of tail docking, which is the practice of cutting off their tails without any anesthetic. Okay, it's just kind of a side note. If you only make one single change after seeing this presentation, on a personal note, I hope that you stop eating pork. It's probably the cruelest of all of the animal industries, which is saying a lot, as you've seen so far. Imagine keeping a pregnant dog locked in a closet for 16 weeks, or cutting off a puppy's tail without any anesthetic. These would all be felony animal cruelty charges if done to animals that we keep as pets, but they're completely legal when they're done to animals that are even smarter because we like the way that they taste. Okay. Are there any questions about this? Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about public health. So the animals are given a barrage of antibiotics, hormones, and other pharmaceuticals in their feed in order to keep them alive until slaughter, despite their really filthy conditions. So in pigs, the drugs are most needed for respiratory problems. The dense quantities of animals with stress-weakened immune systems, and also the toxic gases that from the accumulating urine and feces, ensure that 30 to 70% of pigs have a respiratory infection by the time of slaughter, and over 50% of the workers on pork factory farms experience chronic bronchitis from these conditions. So the combination of the constant sickness and the increased use of antibiotics promotes the evolution of new, stronger types of bacteria and viruses. Because bacteria and viruses are always evolving when they're given antibiotics, and so when you have tons of sick animals all crammed together, all being given antibiotics. You just have these constantly evolving bacteria and viruses. And then when you have humans work with these sick animals and their filth, it really creates the perfect environment for an epidemic. So for instance, the first swine flu outbreak was at a Smithfield pork factory farm in Mexico. The American Public Health Association has urged for a moratorium on factory farms, and scientists on the Pew Commission, the World Health Organization, and the Centers for Disease Control have all warned that we may be faced with epidemics that do not respond to antibiotics if we continue the current factory farming practices. It was really scary doing research for this presentation because I saw that the American Public Health Association actually urged for a moratorium on factory farms back in 1997. So that was over 10 years ago, and still nothing has been done. And sure enough, since then you've seen the rise of swine flu and bird flu and also methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus staph infections, MRSA. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but that's also a result of factory farms recently that's spreading. Okay, so you might ask, well, why aren't conditions changing if so many important agencies have warned against the current practices? And there's one really simple answer, and that's money. So a lot of people are against the huge profits that drug companies make, the monopolies that they have. There's a lot of talk about that with all the healthcare debates. But most people don't realize that the largest consumer of antibiotics in this country is actually animals. So in the U.S., 3 million pounds of antibiotics are given to humans each year, and 24.6 million pounds are fed to livestock for non-therapeutic uses alone. That's not even counting antibiotics given to animals that are actually really sick. More than half of these antibiotics are currently illegal for use in the European Union, so they actually don't import our meat because of this. So once the animals are given those antibiotics, they pass through their systems into their manure, which farm workers come into direct contact with, and which leaches into the groundwater, as I'll talk about later, and passes into local communities, increasing resistance to antibiotics there. So for instance, fluoroquinolones, they're a type of antibiotic. They're actually the most commonly prescribed class of antibiotics back in 2002. When the USDA approved them for use in chickens, which they did against the warnings of the Centers for Disease Control, resistance to that type of antibiotic rose from 0% to 18% in humans. So we really are facing the possibility of not having effective antibiotics if we keep using them at this scale with animals. Okay. Any questions about that?
What is that? Porcupine?
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So I'm going to talk about workers' rights. Meatpacking is the most dangerous job in the United States. The injury rate in slaughterhouses is 3 times higher than in a typical American factory, and the rate of cumulative trauma injuries, which comes from doing one repetitive motion over and over again, is 33 times higher than the national industry average. So the faster the production line, the more injuries there are. 20 years ago, plants slaughtered 175 cattle an hour. Today, some plants slaughter up to 400 cattle an hour, which is about 6 animals per minute. Because meatpacking is such a dangerous and unpleasant job, factory farms always recruit the most desperate and often as a result the most vulnerable populations. So Immigration and Naturalization Services estimates that 1/4 of the workers in Nebraska and Iowa slaughterhouses are undocumented. And since, and most of these slaughterhouse workers do not have health insurance and they're not unionized despite the extremely dangerous working conditions. If there is any profession that would need to be unionized and have health care, it would be slaughterhouse workers. Also, because they're not unionized, they're forced to accept lower wages. Also, most of these employees are hired at will, which means that they can be fired without warning for any reason at any time. So this arrangement really ensures that workers are not going to speak out against abuses because who are they going to complain to? They're scared of being deported or they're scared of losing the only job that they can find to support their families. These workers are also under tremendous pressure not to report injuries. Managers receive financial compensation for having low injury rates, and the easiest way to do that, rather than improving working conditions, is just pressuring your workers into not reporting injuries. So often if they do insist on reporting them and seeking medical care, they'll be fired. So there's actually a job that's even worse than the regular meatpacking crew, and that's the job of the late-night cleaning crew. The vast majority of these employees are undocumented immigrants. They're considered independent contractors, so there aren't any official statistics kept on them. And because they're not one profession, they're obviously not unionized, and they earn hourly wages that are even lower than regular meatpacking crew. So I think it's pretty safe to say that these people have the worst job in the United States. They arrive around midnight, and by sunrise, they have to clean the remains of the 3,000 to 4,000 cattle that have been slaughtered at the plant that day. And they clean using a high-pressure hose that shoots a mixture of 180-degree water and chlorine. And they have to clean while the machines are running in order to get the blood and gristle out of all the cogs and everything. So it's incredibly dangerous. And the high-pressure water and chlorine fogs up the place, so there's very low visibility. There aren't any records of the death rates and injury rates because they're not one profession, they're independent contractors. But there are sample lists of their injuries, and it's pretty horrifying. You can imagine if you're cleaning around all these really sharp, dangerous machines that are running, people often lose limbs or get pulled into cogs and crushed. At a national beef plant in Kansas, a man climbed into a blood collection tank 30 feet high to clean it, but was overcome by the hydrogen sulfide fumes and fell in. 2 other workers climbed into the tank to try to rescue him, but all 3 men died. 8 years earlier, another worker had been killed by the fumes in that same tank, and another man had died trying to save him. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration actually fined National Beef for its negligence in that case, but the fine was $480 for each man's death. So obviously even the government regards these workers as completely expendable. So, even if you really don't care about animals, what about the people who are subjected to these conditions? Why pay companies to exploit immigrants who suffer hideous injuries or even die? And remember that even if you buy organic or free range, the animals are still sent to these same industrial slaughterhouses that support these worker practices.